Imagine for a moment that your mind is like a room. Every thought you have, every worry, every plan, every memory becomes another piece of furniture inside that room. At first, a chair here, a table there. But soon, without realizing it, you've filled every corner. The room becomes so crowded, so stuffed, that there's no space left to walk, no room to breathe, and no place for anything new to enter. That's how most of us live. We carry thoughts like heavy boxes stacked in the attic of our minds. Old regrets, future fears, endless comparisons, the constant noise of what if and what's next. And then we wonder why we feel suffocated. Buddhism has a simple but astonishing answer, because a mind that is full holds nothing, but a mind that is empty holds everything. Now, emptiness may sound frightening. We're conditioned to think of empty as a lack, a void, something missing. An empty wallet, an empty house, an empty heart. These sound like losses. But in the teachings of meditation, emptiness is not a loss. It is a liberation. Think about a cup. If the cup is already full, brimming with old tea, stagnant and stale, there's no space for fresh water to be poured in. Only when it is emptied can it receive something new. The same is true of our minds. When they are crammed with restless thoughts, there's no room for clarity, no room for peace. But when they become empty, truly empty, they transform into vast, open spaces capable of holding the entire sky. This is the paradox of emptiness, that in becoming nothing, the mind becomes infinite. Meditation is the doorway into this paradox. Sitting in silence, letting go of clinging thoughts, you begin to sense that what you called your mind is not a container of fixed ideas but a vast openness, like the sky itself. The clouds of thoughts drift by, but they do not stain the sky. They come, they go, yet the sky remains boundless. And here lies a subtle truth. Emptiness is not about destroying thoughts or escaping life. It's about realizing that your thoughts, your emotions, even your identity are not solid walls but passing shadows. They arise, they pass away. What remains is the spaciousness that can hold them all. When we cling to thoughts, they weigh us down. When we cling to identities, they limit us. But when we let go, the mind becomes light, expansive, limitless. This is why the Zen masters often speak in riddles. Empty your mind and you will discover the universe. To the logical mind, it sounds absurd. But to the meditative heart, it is the most natural truth. Consider this. Music only exists because of silence. Without the empty spaces between notes, there is no melody. Architecture only works because of emptiness. Walls alone do not make a home. It is the space within them that shelters you. The beauty of a vase is in the hollow center that can hold flowers. In the same way, your mind's greatest power lies not in what it clings to, but in the space it leaves open. And yet, emptiness is not something we can force. You cannot try to be empty, the same way you cannot smooth the surface of a pond by pressing it down with your hand. The more you try, the more ripples you create. Emptiness happens when you stop grasping, stop forcing, stop crowding the mind with effort. It comes like the dawn, quietly, when you allow yourself to simply be. This is why meditation is often called the art of letting go. Not the art of achieving, not the art of conquering, but the gentle art of release. In release, the mind becomes light. In lightness, it becomes empty. And in emptiness, it becomes vast enough to hold everything. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, when your mind is packed with worries, anxieties, endless to-do lists, remember this paradox. What you need is not more to hold on to, but less. The treasure is not an addition, but subtraction. By emptying, you are not losing, you are gaining space, clarity, and freedom. The paradox of emptiness is that it feels like nothing, yet it contains everything. A mind that lets go of its clutter becomes the mind that can hold the sky, the mountains, the rivers, the laughter of children, the stillness of dawn. It becomes a mirror, clear enough to reflect the whole universe. And once you glimpse this, even for a moment, you realize that emptiness is not absence. It is presence in its purest form. Close your eyes for a moment and simply listen. Not to me, not to the world outside, but to what's happening inside your own head. You'll notice that even in silence, your mind is far from quiet. Thoughts rush in like traffic at rush hour, honking, swerving, colliding. Memories replay, plans unfold, worries whisper. It never stops. This endless chatter is what Buddhists call the monkey mind, restless, jumping from branch to branch, never still for even a breath. And because of this noise, peace slips through our fingers like water. Think about it. When was the last time you truly felt still? Not distracted by a notification, not haunted by something left undone, not planning the next step before the present moment has even finished. For many of us, stillness feels almost impossible because the mind refuses to stop talking. Why is it like this? Why is our inner world so noisy? Part of it comes from survival. The mind evolved to protect us, constantly scanning for danger, rehearsing future scenarios, calculating outcomes. But what once helped us survive the wilderness now traps us in mental overdrive. The danger today isn't a tiger lurking in the forest, it's an email, a bill, a judgment from others. Yet the mind reacts with the same urgency, as if every thought is life or death. Another part comes from craving. We crave stimulation, we crave validation, we crave escape. The moment we're alone in silence, we reach for our phones, our playlists, our distractions. We are terrified of the quiet because in quiet, the noise inside is exposed. But here's the problem. The more noise we carry, the less room we have for peace. Imagine a glass of water filled with dirt, shaken constantly. The dirt never settles, the water never clears. That's our mind, always stirred by endless thought, never clear enough to reflect the truth. There's a story from Zen tradition. A young student asked his master, "Why can't I find peace?" The master filled a cup with water and stirred it until it was cloudy. "This is your mind," he said, "always moving, always restless. How can you see clearly in muddy water?" The student asked, "Then how do I make it clear?" The master simply placed the cup down. "Leave it alone," he said, and slowly the dirt settled to the bottom, the water becoming still. This is the essence of meditation, not fighting the noise, but letting it settle on its own. Yet most of us don't give it a chance. We keep stirring the cup. We replay old arguments, we predict future disasters, we compare ourselves to others, we construct endless what-if scenarios. We fill the room of the mind with so much clutter that when peace knocks on the door, there is simply no space left for it to enter. Think of your daily life. From the moment you wake up, noise begins. The alarm, the rush to check messages, the flood of news, the endless scroll. You carry this noise into work, into conversations, into your very sleep. Even when your body rests, your mind doesn't. You dream in chaos because the mind never had its silence returned. And so we ask, why can't I hold peace? The answer is simple, because the hands of the mind are already full. This is why emptiness is so vital. To experience peace, we must first create space for it. A crowded heart cannot feel love deeply. A noisy mind cannot hear wisdom. Just as a room filled with clutter cannot welcome a guest, a mind filled with chatter cannot welcome peace. The irony is that we often search for peace as if it were something outside. A retreat in the mountains, a perfect vacation, a quiet cabin by the sea. But peace is not in a place. It is in the silence beneath the noise, already within you. Meditation doesn't bring peace from somewhere else. It simply clears away what blocks it. Imagine walking into a library. If every speaker in the room blasted music, lectures, and conversations all at once, you would never hear the quiet turning of a page. But when the noise is switched off, the silence reveals itself. The library hasn't changed, you've just removed the interference. The same is true of your mind. Peace has always been there, waiting beneath the static. The challenge is that we've grown so used to noise, we mistake it for normal. We believe stress, anxiety, distraction are just part of being alive. But the Buddha's insight was radical. Suffering is not inevitable. It is created by clinging, by craving, by refusing to let the mind be still. And if suffering is created, it can also be uncreated. So the real question isn't, where can I find peace? The question is, what noise am I willing to let go of so that peace can reveal itself? Every thought that clutters, every desire that pulls, every fear that binds, they are the walls keeping you from the open sky. Remove them, and suddenly, peace is no longer something you chase. It is something you return to. And once you understand this, the journey becomes clear. If the noise of the mind blocks peace, then learning to quiet that noise is the first step. And that is where meditation enters, not as a ritual, not as a performance, but as the art of emptying, the practice of letting the mind rest. Sit down, close your eyes, take a breath. It sounds so simple, yet anyone who has tried knows it isn't. The moment you sit, the mind rebels. Thoughts pour in like a broken dam. You remember an old conversation. You imagine tomorrow's meeting. You feel an itch on your arm. The silence you hoped for becomes a storm. This is why so many people give up, saying, "I can't meditate. My mind is too busy." But here's the secret. Meditation is not about forcing silence. It is not about killing thoughts. It is not about becoming some perfect monk with a blank mind. Meditation is the art of emptying, not by pushing things out, but by learning not to hold them. Imagine standing by a river. Leaves, sticks, and petals float by. Each one is a thought. Most of us spend our lives jumping into the river, grabbing each leaf, clutching each stick, examining each petal. We get carried downstream by the current. Meditation teaches you to stand on the bank and watch. The river flows, but you remain still. Thoughts come, thoughts go, but you don't chase them. Slowly, you discover that you are not the river, you are the awareness watching it. This is emptying, not destroying the river, but releasing your grip on it. Zen masters often give strange instructions like, sit without trying to sit, breathe without trying to breathe. At first, this sounds absurd, but the truth is emptiness cannot be forced. If you try too hard to empty the mind, you only create more noise. Am I doing it right? Why isn't it working? Why am I still thinking? That effort itself becomes another thought, another ripple. Instead, meditation is surrender. It is like unclenching a fist you didn't realize was tight. The moment you let go, the hand opens naturally. The mind is the same. Let go of the need to control it, and it begins to empty on its own. And when it does, something extraordinary happens. The chatter doesn't disappear, but it loses its power. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer hook you. Anxieties still whisper, but they no longer drag you into storms. You see them for what they are, passing ripples on a vast, open sea. This is why the Buddha compared the meditative mind to a clear mirror. When the mirror is covered in dust, it reflects nothing. But when it is wiped clean, it reflects the world exactly as it is. Meditation is the wiping. Emptiness is the clarity. Think of how often we suffer not because of reality, but because of the stories we pile on top of it. Someone says a careless word and instantly our mind creates a storm. They don't respect me. I must have done something wrong. What if they always think this way? The word is gone in a second, but our thoughts multiply endlessly. Meditation cuts this chain. It shows us a word is just a sound. A thought is just a cloud. We don't need to build palaces of suffering around them. And the beauty of meditation is that you don't need special tools. You don't need incense, mantras, or even hours of time. All you need is your breath. Right here, right now. Each inhale is an invitation. Each exhale is a release. Slowly, the breath becomes an anchor holding you steady as the waves of thought roll by. At first, the practice feels clumsy. You will notice yourself lost in thought 100 times, but that is not failure. That is the training. Each time you return to the breath, you are choosing emptiness over attachment, stillness over noise. Over time, the space between thoughts grows wider. The grip of craving grows weaker, and the silence that once felt impossible begins to appear softly, like dawn breaking after a long night. Meditation is often called coming home. Why? Because emptiness is not something new we create. It is something we return to. Beneath the clutter, beneath the chaos, beneath the endless stories, we discover the natural spaciousness that was always there. A mind that has tasted this knows a new kind of freedom. It is no longer pulled like a puppet by every impulse. It no longer fears silence. It no longer clings to each passing thought as if it were truth. Instead, it learns to rest empty, open, alive. And here's the paradox. In becoming empty, the mind becomes full of peace, full of clarity, full of compassion, because when the noise subsides, what remains is not nothing. It is the deepest presence of all. So the art of meditation is not about escaping life. It is about emptying yourself enough to finally hold life as it is, to drink tea without distraction, to listen to a friend without judgment, to breathe without needing anything more than this moment. In emptiness, we discover that nothing is missing. Emptiness, few words in Buddhism have been so misunderstood and yet so essential as this one. In Sanskrit, it is called Śūnyatā. At first hearing, people imagine a void, a black nothingness, a cold abyss where nothing matters. But that is not what the Buddha meant. Emptiness is not a negation, it is a revelation. To understand it, imagine standing in a forest. You look at a tree. At first, it seems solid, independent, standing by itself. But if you look more deeply, you see the truth. The tree is not separate. It contains the soil, the rain, the sunlight. It contains the seed from which it grew, the hands that planted it, the air it breathes. Remove the rain, the tree vanishes. Remove the sunlight, the tree vanishes. Remove the soil, the tree vanishes. The tree exists only because everything else exists. This is emptiness. Not that the tree is nothing, but that it is empty of a separate, permanent self. The Buddha taught that everything is like this, our bodies, our thoughts, even what we call me. We are not isolated beings floating alone. We are woven from countless causes and conditions. Your breath is the gift of trees. Your life is the gift of parents. Your food is the gift of earth and farmers and sunlight. There is no fixed self inside you. You are a living intersection of the entire universe. Emptiness, then, is interdependence. It is freedom from the illusion that things stand alone. But why does this matter? Because clinging to the illusion of separateness is the root of suffering. We say, this is mine, this is me, this is who I am. We build identities, possessions, stories, and when these change, as everything inevitably does, we feel pain. But if we see with the eye of emptiness, we realize there is no fixed me to protect, no permanent thing to lose. What we call self is a flowing river, not a frozen stone. This is why Zen masters laugh when asked, "Who are you?" They know the question cannot be answered with a single name or identity. To say, "I am this," is already too small. Emptiness is too vast to be captured by words. There's a famous teaching from the Heart Sutra, perhaps the most recited text in all of Mahayana Buddhism. It says, "Form is emptiness and emptiness is form." At first, this sounds like a riddle. How can something be both form and emptiness? Think of a wave in the ocean. The wave has a form, its height, its movement, its rise and fall. But look deeper and you see. The wave is nothing but water. Its form is temporary. Its reality is the ocean itself. Emptiness means the wave is not separate from the ocean. And yet emptiness does not destroy the wave, it allows it to exist. In the same way, every person, every moment, everything is a wave rising and falling on the ocean of reality. To see this is to be free. Free from fear because nothing is truly lost, it only changes form. Free from pride because nothing is truly yours. Everything arises from conditions beyond you. Free from despair because emptiness is not bleak, it is infinite possibility. One Zen master put it beautifully. When you realize emptiness, the whole universe fits into your heart. And here is the wonder. Emptiness is not abstract philosophy. It is something you can taste directly in meditation. When the mind quiets, when thoughts loosen their grip, you begin to feel this interconnection. You sense that the boundary between you and the world is thinner than you ever imagined. The air you breathe is not other than you. The sounds you hear are not outside of you. The line between inside and outside dissolves, and for a moment you become as wide as the sky. That is the lived experience of Śūnyatā. It is not thinking about emptiness, but being it. And yet, words will always fail. Emptiness cannot be caught by concepts. It can only be lived. The Buddha himself often refused to define it too tightly, because the danger is that people cling even to the idea of emptiness, and that too becomes an obstacle. So he gave us not a belief, but a practice. Sit, breathe, look deeply into your own mind. Notice how every thought arises from causes, how every feeling passes, how even you are not the same from moment to moment. This direct seeing is the gateway to freedom. Emptiness is not cold, it is compassion itself. Because when you realize there is no separate self, the barrier between me and you dissolves. Your suffering is my suffering. Your joy is my joy. To harm another is to harm myself. To love another is to awaken the universe within me. This is the power of Śūnyatā, the philosophy that empties in order to fill. It removes illusions in order to reveal truth. It takes away separateness in order to uncover oneness. And once this is seen, even for a breath, the world changes. The tree is no longer just a tree. It is the earth, the rain, the sun, the cosmos. You are no longer just a self. You are the dance of the whole universe for a fleeting but precious moment. And life itself is no longer a burden. It is a miracle of emptiness, endlessly unfolding. There's an old Zen story. A scholar once visited a Zen master eager to learn the way of wisdom. The master poured him tea. The cup filled, then overflowed, spilling across the table. The scholar shouted, "Stop! The cup is full, no more can go in." The master looked at him and said, "Like this cup, your mind is full. How can I show you the truth unless you first empty it?" It is such a simple story, but it carries the heart of Buddhist wisdom. The cup must be empty to hold tea. We live as if our cups are always overflowing with opinions, judgments, plans, and endless noise. We say we want peace, but we fill ourselves with chaos. We say we want wisdom, but we cling to old certainties. We say we want love, but we crowd our hearts with fear. And so, even when life tries to pour its blessings into us, there is no space for them to enter. Think of how we approach each day. We wake up already full of yesterday's regrets, full of tomorrow's worries, full of today's tasks. When someone speaks to us, we don't really listen. We only wait for our turn to respond. When a new idea comes, we don't consider it. We measure it against what we already believe. We are like the scholar's cup, already spilling over, yet still demanding more. But emptiness changes everything. To empty the cup is to create space. To create space is to allow. And to allow is to finally receive. Look around and you will see this truth everywhere. A house is only useful because of its empty rooms. A vase is beautiful, but its true purpose lies in the hollow center that holds the flowers. Music touches our hearts not just because of the notes, but because of the silence between them. Without emptiness, there is no form, no beauty, no life. The same is true of us. If we never empty ourselves, we never truly receive life. Imagine listening to a piece of music. If every instrument played constantly without pause, it would be unbearable. But because there is silence, rhythm, and space, the melody lives. Our minds too need silence. They need pauses. They need emptiness, or else the song of life becomes just noise. And this emptiness is not passive. It is alive, creative, fertile. Just as a farmer clears the field before planting, emptiness prepares the ground for growth. Just as the womb is empty before it carries new life, so must the heart be open before it can hold compassion. Think about relationships. How often do we miss connection because we are too full of ourselves, our opinions, our assumptions, our need to be right? To truly listen to someone is to empty yourself for a moment, to create space inside where their words can land. Without emptiness, there is no real listening. Without emptiness, there is no real love. And what about learning? The greatest obstacle to wisdom is the belief that we already know. The beginner's mind, as Zen calls it, is open, curious, ready to receive. It is empty and therefore limitless. The expert's mind, often too full of certainty, leaves no room for growth. That is why the master said, "Empty your cup." So how do we do this? How do we live with a cup that is empty yet ready to be filled? It begins with awareness. Notice when your mind is clinging too tightly. Notice when you are holding onto old anger or rehearsing old stories. Then with a breath, let them go. Empty the cup, not forever, just for this moment. It continues with humility. Approach each day not as someone who already knows, but as someone ready to learn. Each sunrise can teach you. Each conversation can reveal something new. Each silence can open a door you didn't know existed, and it deepens with trust. Trust that emptiness is not loss but space. When you let go of the clutter, you are not left with nothing, you are left with openness. And in openness, life pours itself in. The Zen tradition often uses ordinary images to reveal extraordinary truths. A cup, a vase, a room, a pause in music. These simple things remind us that emptiness is not abstract philosophy. It is the hidden force that makes everything possible. So the next time you hold a cup of tea, remember, its value is not in the ceramic but in the empty space within. Without emptiness, there is no tea, no nourishment, no warmth in your hands. And the same is true of your life. Your mind, your heart, your spirit, they are cups. Keep them overflowing with noise and you will miss the taste of peace. Empty them and you will discover they can hold the whole universe. Have you ever walked into a room so crowded with objects that you could barely move? Boxes stacked to the ceiling, clothes spilling from drawers, every corner overflowing. You stand there overwhelmed and you realize you cannot breathe. That is what the inside of most minds looks like. We imagine freedom as something we chase outside ourselves. Wealth, power, status, recognition. But the truth is, the greatest prison is built within. And its walls are made not of stone, but of clutter. Thoughts upon thoughts, fears upon fears, memories stacked on top of expectation, until there is no room left for peace. This is why, even when life is good, we feel restless. Even when silence surrounds us, we still hear the noise. Even when we achieve what we wanted, it never feels enough. Because the clutter follows us. It lives inside us. Think of how many things you are carrying right now. The argument from 3 years ago that still stings, fear of what might happen tomorrow. The list of tasks that never seems to end. The identity you cling to, the role you play, the mask you wear, layer upon layer upon layer. We hold them all tightly as if letting go would mean losing ourselves. But in truth, it is this holding on that keeps us trapped. A cluttered mind is like a crowded room. No matter what you add, it will never feel spacious. No matter what you achieve, it will never feel enough. You will always feel cornered, restless, suffocated. And yet most people don't even see their clutter. They mistake it for themselves. They say, I am my worries, I am my achievements, I am my memories. But who were you before all of that? Who are you beneath the noise? The Buddha once compared the mind to a monkey, always leaping from branch to branch, never still. But perhaps even more fitting in today's world, the mind is like a browser with too many tabs open. Each tab is pulling at your attention, draining your energy. You don't even remember what half the tabs are for, yet you can't bring yourself to close them, so the system slows down, it freezes, it crashes. This is the prison we live in, a cage made of our own attachments, and like any prison, escape begins with awareness. The moment you see the bars, you are no longer fully trapped. When you notice how cluttered your thoughts are, when you realize you have been carrying the same fear, the same resentment, the same story for years, suddenly a door appears. But walking through that door requires courage, because emptiness to the cluttered mind feels terrifying. We are so used to being full, even full of suffering, that the idea of space feels like loss. Who am I if I let go of this resentment? Who am I if I release this identity? Who am I if my mind is quiet? This is why meditation feels so difficult at first. You sit down, you close your eyes, and suddenly the noise is deafening. The clutter screams for attention. You think, this is not working. But what you are really seeing is the prison itself. Meditation does not create the noise, it reveals it, and only what is seen can be emptied. The clutter is not just thoughts. It is emotions we never faced, stories we told ourselves, beliefs we inherited without question. It is every unhealed wound, every false certainty, every fear of the unknown. Layer after layer, it surrounds us until we can no longer see clearly. But here is the liberating truth. The bars of this prison are not solid, they are made of smoke. The moment you stop holding onto them, they disappear. The moment you stop believing every thought, every fear, every story, space opens up. And in that space, freedom breathes. Imagine for a moment walking into a cluttered room and clearing it out. The boxes are gone. The shelves are empty. Light pours in through the windows. You can finally move. You can finally breathe. This is what happens in the mind when clutter is released. Suddenly, you discover a silence that was always there, waiting. Suddenly, you realize peace was never far away, it was simply buried. And the beauty is, this silence is not empty in the ordinary sense. It is not lifeless or dull. It is alive, radiant, full of possibility. When the prison walls dissolve, you don't step into nothingness, you step into vastness, you step into freedom. The question, then, is not whether freedom exists. It is whether we dare to put down what is weighing us down, whether we dare to empty our minds enough to see what was always here. The Zen masters often say, let go or be dragged. And that is the essence of the cluttered mind. The more you cling, the more you suffer. The more you release, the more space opens. And when space opens, something extraordinary begins to happen. The art of meditation transforms from struggle into simplicity. What was once a battle with thoughts becomes a dance with silence. What once felt like prison begins to feel like home. When the clutter falls away, when the prison walls dissolve, what remains? At first, it feels strange. The silence is unsettling, the vastness almost too wide to bear. For so long, the mind was crowded, noisy, filled with familiar patterns, even painful ones. And now, in emptiness, there is nothing to hold on to. But slowly, something extraordinary begins to happen. Emptiness does not remain empty. Like a cup cleared of stale liquid, it becomes ready to receive something fresh. Like a sky after the storm, it opens, boundless, luminous. This is the hidden gift of meditation. Emptiness blossoms into openness. When the mind is no longer packed with judgments and fears, space opens for compassion. When we are no longer obsessed with ourselves, our story, our image, our wounds, we begin to see others clearly. Their pain resonates, their joy touches us, their presence becomes real. We discover that emptiness is not cold detachment, it is the doorway to connection. Think of it this way. When a mirror is covered in dust, it cannot reflect clearly. But when it is cleaned, it reveals everything without distortion. The mind, once emptied, becomes that mirror. It reflects reality as it is, not as we wish it to be, not as we fear it to be. And in this clarity, understanding arises, compassion arises, love arises. Transformation begins subtly. You notice you are less reactive. The same situation that once sparked anger now meets a calmer response. The insult that once cut deeply now drifts past like wind against an open sky. The worry that once consumed your nights loses its grip. This does not mean life becomes free of problems. Storms still come. But the difference is you are no longer the storm, you are the sky that holds it. There is space. There is openness. And from that openness, wisdom flows. Meditation does not give you new beliefs, it strips away the false ones. It does not add more to your mind, it clears what no longer serves. And in the spaciousness left behind, qualities you never forced begin to bloom naturally. Patience, kindness, resilience, presence. It is like planting a seed in fertile soil. You cannot force it to grow. You can only clear the weeds, water the ground, and trust the process. Meditation clears the soil of the mind. Openness is the garden where transformation takes root. The Buddha described this openness as boundless. Boundless compassion, boundless loving kindness, boundless equanimity. These are not qualities we fabricate. They are qualities we uncover when emptiness makes space for them. And yet the beauty is this transformation does not stay within the cushion. It spills into life. The way you speak softens. The way you listen deepens. The way you walk, eat, breathe all shift, subtly but unmistakably. Others may not know what changed, but they feel it. They sense the calm in your presence, the openness in your gaze, the spaciousness in your words. This is why meditation is often called a practice, not an escape. We do not meditate to flee life. We meditate to return to it more fully, more openly, more alive. But perhaps the greatest transformation is this. Emptiness dissolves the illusion of separation. You begin to see that the line between self and other is not so solid. The air you breathe was once breathed by countless beings. The food you eat is the work of countless hands. Your life is woven into every other life. When the mind is cluttered, you cannot see this. When the mind is empty, openness reveals it. And in that realization, compassion is no longer an effort, it becomes natural. Helping others is no longer a duty, it is an expression of who you are. So, emptiness is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of openness. And openness is the soil where the deepest transformation unfolds. From the prison of a cluttered mind, we step into the vastness of awareness. From the tight grip of identity, we loosen into compassion. From silence, life begins to sing again. There is a common misunderstanding about emptiness. People hear the word and immediately think of a void, a dark nothingness where nothing matters. They imagine a hollow abyss, cold and meaningless. But that is not what the Buddha meant. Emptiness is not nihilism, it is not despair, it is not a denial of life. In truth, emptiness is freedom, it is possibility, it is limitless potential. Imagine a blank canvas. At first glance, it looks empty, just white space. But within that emptiness lies the possibility for infinite creations. A landscape, a portrait, an abstract masterpiece, all are waiting, hidden in the canvas. Emptiness does not mean nothing is there. It means anything can be, or think of music. Without silence between the notes, there could be no melody, no rhythm, no harmony. The silence, what seems like emptiness, is what makes the music possible. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom. To see emptiness is not to see nothing. It is to see that all things arise because of conditions. Nothing stands alone, nothing exists by itself. And because of that, everything is interconnected, fluid, alive. When we mistake emptiness for nihilism, we close the door to meaning. But when we understand emptiness as potential, we open ourselves to wonder. Suddenly, life is not a fixed script. It is a living, unfolding dance. Think of a seed. In itself, it is small, fragile, almost insignificant. But its emptiness, its lack of fixed form, makes it capable of becoming a tree, a forest, even the home for countless birds and insects. The seed's power lies not in being something static, but in its capacity to transform. That is emptiness. In meditation, when we taste emptiness, we are not erasing ourselves into nothing. We are opening ourselves into possibility. We are loosening the rigid grip of identity. I am this, I am not that, and in doing so, we allow the fullness of life to flow through us. And this is where the transformation deepens. When you no longer see yourself as a fixed, unchanging self, you stop being trapped in your story. The pain you carry is no longer eternal. The mistakes you made are no longer chains. Even your joy and success are not prisons. Everything becomes fluid. Everything becomes alive. That is why emptiness is liberation. It frees us from the illusion of permanence, the burden of clinging, the weight of rigid identity. But let's be clear. Emptiness does not mean life is meaningless. On the contrary, it reveals how precious life truly is. Because nothing is fixed, every moment matters. Because everything changes, each breath, each smile, each act of kindness carries immeasurable value. This is why the Buddha did not teach emptiness to depress us, he taught it to awaken us. To help us see life not as a heavy burden but as a field of boundless possibility. Nihilism says, nothing matters. Emptiness whispers, everything is possible. And when we live from this perspective, the way we engage with the world changes. We stop clinging to rigid roles, we stop fearing change, we stop building walls around ourselves. Instead, we meet life openly, like water taking the shape of whatever vessel it enters. We flow, we adapt, we live with freedom. Think of relationships. When we cling to a fixed image of who someone should be, we suffer when they change. But when we embrace emptiness, we allow them to evolve. Just as we evolve, we meet them anew in each moment. Love becomes lighter, freer, more alive. Think of challenges. When we see them as permanent obstacles, we despair. But when we see them through the lens of emptiness, we realize they are conditions that will also change. They too are fluid. And within them lies the potential for growth, for wisdom, for strength. Emptiness, then, is not an end. It is the soil of beginnings. It is the openness from which creativity, compassion, and wisdom arise. And perhaps most beautifully, it reveals that life is not about holding on, it is about participating. It is not about finding something permanent to cling to. It is about dancing with impermanence moment by moment, breath by breath. So when the mind empties in meditation, do not fear the void. Do not mistake it for nothingness. See it as the vast sky, open to every possibility. See it as the ocean, capable of holding every wave. See it as the source from which all beauty, all compassion, all wisdom flows. Because emptiness is not the absence of life. It is the very condition that makes life possible. Emptiness sounds profound when spoken in temples, whispered in meditation halls, or written in ancient sutras. But wisdom is not meant to stay locked in books or kept only for monks. It is meant to be lived. The question is, how can we practice emptiness in the ordinary rhythm of daily life? When we wake up, commute, work, cook, laugh, argue, and dream, where does emptiness find its place? The answer begins with presence. When you drink a cup of tea, most of the time your mind is elsewhere, thinking of tasks, replaying conversations, rushing into the future. But to practice emptiness is to let go of those clinging thoughts and meet the moment as it is. The cup is just the cup. The tea is just the tea. Nothing more, nothing less. Emptying your mind of labels, judgments, and stories, you discover the simple miracle of taste, warmth, and presence. This is not escape. It is intimacy. When you stop overlaying the world with endless commentary, you finally touch reality as it is. Another practice is listening. Normally, when someone speaks, we don't truly hear. We listen with an agenda, preparing our response, judging, comparing, or interrupting in our mind. But what happens when we practice emptiness in listening? When we let go of the noise of our own thoughts and simply receive? Suddenly, listening becomes an act of love. You hear not only the words, but also the silence between them, the pain behind them, the humanity within them. To practice emptiness is also to release your tight grip on identity. Notice how often we define ourselves. I am this kind of person. I could never do that. I must always be seen this way. These fixed labels become walls around us. But what if you lived as an open field instead of a closed box? What if you saw yourself as fluid, unfolding, not yet finished? Each time you allow yourself to change, to learn, to soften, to forgive, you are practicing emptiness. And this extends to how we deal with emotions. Anger arises, sadness comes, fear tightens its grip. The ordinary response is to say, this is who I am right now. I am angry, I am broken, I am afraid. But practicing emptiness means remembering, these emotions are not fixed identities. They are clouds passing through the sky of awareness. Let them come. Let them go. You are the sky, not the storm. Another doorway into emptiness is through simplicity. Our lives are so cluttered with possessions, with information, with endless demands. But when you simplify, you create space. When you give away what you don't need, when you stop chasing every desire, when you choose stillness instead of constant distraction, you are not losing anything. You are gaining emptiness, and within that emptiness, peace. But perhaps the most powerful practice is in how we meet impermanence. Everything changes. Relationships, careers, health, even the body itself. We suffer when we resist this truth. But when we embrace emptiness, we accept impermanence not as loss, but as the way life flows. We stop clinging to the past. We stop fearing the future. We rest in the openness of the present. The art of practicing emptiness, then, is not about withdrawing from life. It is about engaging with life fully without the chains of clinging. It is about walking lightly, speaking gently, loving deeply, while knowing all things are fluid, interconnected, and free. Imagine a dancer on stage. If she clings too tightly to one step, she stumbles. But if she flows with the music moment by moment, she becomes grace itself. That is emptiness in motion. And so, in the ordinary rhythm of your day, you can practice. When you walk, feel each step. When you eat, taste each bite. When you work, be with the task. When you love, let love flow without possession. When you lose, let go without bitterness. This is not about perfection. It is about openness. It is about remembering again and again that emptiness is not an abstract idea. It is the living breath of this very moment. And here lies the quiet beauty. The more you practice emptiness, the more you realize that emptiness is fullness. The empty mind holds everything. The sound of birds, the laughter of a child, the tears of grief, the whisper of wind through trees. Nothing is excluded. Everything belongs. This is the everyday miracle of practicing emptiness. It turns life itself into meditation. It transforms the ordinary into the sacred. Silence, that is how it begins. When the mind finally releases its grip on constant noise, when the chatter softens, the judgments dissolve, the stories unravel, what remains is not nothingness but a vast, infinite openness. An empty mind, yet it feels full. Full of clarity, full of life, full of the boundless universe itself. This is the great paradox we have traveled together. Emptiness is not absence. It is presence at its deepest. It is the field from which everything arises. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the night sky. At first, you may notice only the stars, points of light scattered across the darkness, but look deeper. Beyond the stars, beyond the galaxies, beyond the furthest reaches your eyes can see, there is endless space. That infinite space is what allows the stars to exist, to shine, to move. Without emptiness, there is no universe. In the same way, when your mind becomes spacious, empty of clinging, empty of self, empty of the constant need to hold onto everything, you begin to see clearly. You begin to feel the vastness that was always here. Inside this emptiness, life flows effortlessly. Thoughts arise and pass, emotions visit and leave, experiences bloom and fade. Nothing needs to be held. Nothing needs to be forced. The Buddha once compared the awakened mind to a clear mirror. When the dust is wiped away, the mirror reflects everything perfectly, without distortion, without resistance. The empty mind is that mirror. It holds mountains and rivers, joy and sorrow, beginnings and endings, all without preference, all without fear. And here is the wonder. When you live with such emptiness, you do not shrink from the world, you embrace it more fully. The laughter of a child becomes more radiant. The tears of a loved one become more tender. The rustle of leaves in the wind becomes a song. In emptiness, everything is seen, felt, and cherished because nothing is clung to. This is not escape. This is awakening. An empty mind is a compassionate mind. Why? Because when you are not full of yourself, your stories, your fears, your demands, you finally have room to hold others. Their joys become your joys. Their suffering becomes your call to love. Emptiness does not make you cold. It makes you vast enough to hold the whole world. And so, practicing emptiness is not about becoming detached or indifferent. It is about becoming free. Free to love without chains. Free to live without fear. Free to die without regret. The path we have walked, from the noise of the mind to the art of meditation to the wisdom of emptiness in daily life, leads here to this realization. The universe is not outside of you. It is mirrored within your empty mind. When you let go, you do not lose the world, you gain it in its entirety. So the question is no longer, what can I hold on to? But rather, how deeply can I let go? For the more you release, the more spacious you become. And the more spacious you become, the more you discover that the infinite has always been here, waiting, shining quietly inside you. As this journey comes to a close, let us end not with answers, but with an invitation. Sit in stillness. Breathe. Let the thoughts drift like clouds. Let the heart open like the sky. Let emptiness reveal its secret, that within it lies everything. The whole universe shining in the silence of your empty mind. And in that silence, listen. Do you hear it? The sound of freedom, the sound of peace, the sound of the boundless universe within you. If this journey into emptiness touched something within you, let it be a reminder that wisdom is never far away. It is already here, waiting in the silence of your own heart. If you feel called to walk further on this path, to sit with more teachings, more stories, more reflections, you are warmly invited to stay connected with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, so that each step you take in stillness can be supported by a community that seeks the same light. May your path be gentle, your heart spacious, and your mind as vast as the open sky. Until we meet again, breathe deeply, let go softly, and remember, in emptiness, everything is already yours.